I'm Inez.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Amber Duke.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Like usual, I think we have a great lineup of topics for you today. We are unfortunately going to have to kick it off by talking about the consequences of having an open border. Unfortunately, the tragic consequences for a UGA student. And Amber's going to talk us through that. Then we're going to turn to Ben. We're going to talk about Russiagate 2.0 and Smirnov. And then I'm going to talk about the net choice case at SCOTUS and social media censorship. And finally, Will is going to talk about Google's ultra woke AI, Gemini. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amber to discuss the open border, immigration, and the potentially tragic consequences of having people here who ought not to be.
Thank you. Yes, unfortunately, over the weekend, there was a tragic case where a University of Georgia nursing student named Laken Riley was murdered by an illegal immigrant who came to America from Venezuela. And this is not the first instance of this happening, certainly not the first high-profile instance. There was the Molly Tibbetts murder. She was an Iowa jogger a few years back. There was the case of Kate Steinle in California, who was allegedly hit by an errant bullet fired by an illegal immigrant. And even in just the past couple of weeks, there was a father who was killed by a drunk driver who was an illegal immigrant. And then there was another illegal immigrant who attempted to murder multiple people in a shooting spree. This is the latest example, sadly, of the tragic consequences of open border policy, as Inez mentioned. If insofar as murder is preventable, one of the easiest ways to prevent these murders that we're talking about is by enforcing border security and preventing people who are not allowed to be here, not supposed to be here, from entering the country. The details of how this Venezuelan national got here are incredibly disturbing because they're incredibly routine now under the Biden administration. He came to the US in 2022 and promptly committed crimes. He was arrested in New York for assault of a minor and was promptly released. New York City is a sanctuary city, so the police could not coordinate with ICE to make sure that ICE could come get him from detention and start deportation proceedings. So he quickly fled to Athens, Georgia, where he went on to shoplift. He was only cited with a ticket because that's all we do now for shoplifting. So in addition to this being a story about the consequences of illegal immigration, it's also a story about the consequences of refusing to enforce crime. So he has 2 priors. He's let go on the shoplifting charge. He fails to show up for a court date, as most of these people who get shoplifting citations do, and murders this young nursing student as she's out for a jog. So basically, every policy prescription that conservatives have offered to keep people safe was broken in this case by liberals in charge. And this case comes as Biden reportedly is considering using executive action to make some changes to border policy. Just a couple of weeks ago, Axios reported that Biden was planning on implementing an executive order that would prevent people from claiming asylum if they cross the US border illegally, meaning between ports of entry. And this is fascinating because just a few years ago, when he was campaigning, Biden called this exact policy that was in place under the Trump administration inhumane and cruel. And now he's considering it because he has realized that, of course, he bears a lot of responsibility for if not all of the responsibility for the crisis at the southern border. And that, yes, he does have executive powers available to him to stop this crisis. Contrary to what the Biden White House and Democrats have been telling the American public for the past few months, you don't need to pass the faulty Senate border bill. And border bill is a very loose term in order to affect change at the southern border. Biden has plenty of tools available at his disposal as the president. We saw President Trump use executive authority quite frequently in order to secure the border. In just 1 year, after taking about a half dozen actions, Trump was able to reduce illegal crossings by about 50%. And now Biden has turned around on his position that all of those policies were cruel and is considering enacting them himself. Now, this week on Thursday, Biden and Trump are both visiting the border. Trump's announcement came first and Biden's quickly followed. I believe it's the first time Biden is actually visiting the border since becoming president. And the timing, of course, could not be more, I think, almost cruel to the fact that there are these families now suffering the loss of their loved ones, angel families, we call them. And Biden has waited 3 years to do anything that would have prevented these awful tragedies. And even at this point, the fact that he's considering this one executive action and apparently nothing else portends the idea that he's not really taking this seriously as he should. And then one final point before I kick it to the group is the media coverage or lack thereof of this sad murder of Laken Riley. The Associated Press published an article about this, but decided to make this not a story of illegal immigration, but a story of how women don't feel safe when they're out jogging. That is, I guess, true. I don't jog at night, but talk about missing the point. In fact, in the article, Associated Press didn't even mention the fact that the killer was an illegal immigrant, despite also mentioning the Molly Tibbetts case, where the suspect, again, was also an illegal immigrant. Neither of those things were mentioned in this Associated Press article. They deliberately obfuscated the point in order to draw attention away from the true culprit here, which is Biden's open border policy. So I'll kick it off to the group for any other thoughts on this sad story.
Yeah, just to highlight the last thing that Amber said, the media coverage of this has either not mentioned the fact that the killer was in the country illegally or has buried it like CNN did on paragraph 14 or 15 of its report on this murder. So there's of course an element of the way that the press and what aspects of this murder the press is focusing on that is worth highlighting. The problem here was clearly jogging, right? And I would just like to address the argument that I think a lot on the left are making, and they see this as a numbers game, and I think it's the wrong way to think about it, right? So they've responded to this by saying, okay, only a small percentage of people who are here illegally commit this level of crime, right? Obviously, crossing the border illegally is a crime in itself, and every single person who's here illegally is committing a crime and therefore is criminal. But they essentially want to play this statistics game and have dueling statistics. Who's more violent, right? The native born or people who are here illegally? That's the wrong way to think about this. Of course, there's a level of domestic crime, and that level of domestic crime is, as Amber rightly pointed out, tied very much to the choices of municipalities, states, localities, and how they decide to prosecute crime. That is a domestic issue that the United States needs to deal with. That's a completely separate issue from saying, well, why are we importing more of this from around the world, right? This murder didn't have to happen. The fact that there are many domestic murders that are more difficult to prevent, or we could have taken other steps to prevent, is a different issue logically from whether or not this person should have been here to begin with to commit this particular crime. This was in some sense a completely preventable and unnecessary tragedy. And so I just wanted to address briefly that argument. And then finally, this guy really did do like sort of a tour of blue cities primarily. And it does point again to the fact that the sanctuary city policies of New York and elsewhere are not just now biting them in the rear because they're having to deal with a flood of migrants in terms of the strain on resources and the uptick in crime, which, you know, as a New Yorker, I'm noticing down the street from me. But also because they permit people to move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, people who are committing additional crimes, you know, on top of crossing the border illegally, just like domestic criminals. A lot of these cities are letting these people go to move on to the next jurisdiction, not show up for a court date, as Amber pointed out, happens here. So this is once again this dual failure of having an open border and failing to protect the borders of the United States from people who shouldn't be here to begin with, and then a failure domestically to you know, actually enforce the law and put criminals in jail.
I'll be brief. I think that we should call this policy what it really is, which is a willingness to sacrifice the life and limb of Americans for a permanent Democrat majority. Period, full stop. That is the invasion policy of the administration. If we were Democrats and we were messaging about this issue, that would probably be the soft diplomatic version of what the left would say. Yet this is not the seminal issue that's being talked about, of course, across the media today, because the media is the mouthpiece for an administration that puts the president out, taking questions, so-called, while licking an ice cream cone. And that is kind of the response as the world is burning around him. So, of course, Inez is absolutely right on the merits, but we know that the issue is never really the issue when they try to create a competing narrative here. And in terms of crime rates between natives versus illegals, the point is that there would be no incremental crime were the illegal aliens not invited en masse into the country. So it's a fraudulent argument debate to the extent there even is one. And miraculously, but unsurprisingly, and to the point where we've been numb to it at this point, there were so many failures and breakdowns along the way that allowed this tragedy to happen. But there are thousands of other tragedies as well every single year. And I'm thinking here of not just gang-related violence or property destruction or other crimes committed by illegal aliens, but obviously in fentanyl as well, where you have tens of thousands of people killed also as a consequence of the open borders. So you put it all together, and some U.S. government officials and probably the bulk of the administrative state is, again, willing to sacrifice the life and a limb of the American people for what they believe will be a permanent Democrat majority. And I'll just harp on again, even if there is no mass amnesty, and I always come back to this point, but I think it's worth emphasizing, we still already have foreign election interference because the trillions of federal funds allocated down to the states and the House seats that are apportioned are all based on the total population, not the population of citizens. So already you have blue states that get disproportionate representation in Congress, that are able to backfill lost U.S. citizens when they migrate from blue states to red states. They still get to retain or have artificially more representation in Congress precisely because of the Democrats' invasion policy at the southern border.
Yeah, you'll hear about this from me in the Google AI section, but the purpose of a system is what it does. It's normally talked about in the computer system. The purpose of our immigration policy is to do exactly what Ben described. It is to, unleash crime against American citizens and cement a permanent majority for the Democrats. And so all the humanitarian talk, all that should just be dismissed. We actually look at the concrete results of their policy, and it's obvious what it's doing.
With that, we'll turn back to Ben to talk about Russiagate 2.0.
Well, thanks. And actually, Miranda Devine corrects me in her latest op-ed. It's actually Russiagate 3.0 now. I was one iteration off here. But yes, for those who have been following, Alexander Smirnov, a longtime FBI informant, was indicted by the David Weiss special counsel not even a week after the Robert Hur special counsel report came out, which seems like it was 3 years ago, but it was actually only a few weeks ago, which demonstrated that President Biden, while as a senator and as vice president, unlawfully retained classified documents. And more importantly, from a political perspective, it seems, was cognitively impaired going back to 2017 and only has declined worse since that point. So what happens, of course, within a week, as the timeline consistently reflects when it comes to the lawfare against dissenters in this country, what happens? Alexander Smirnov is indicted and detained. Now, who is Alexander Smirnov? Again, this was someone who was a confidential informant who was a dual U.S. Israeli citizen who for more than a decade supposedly was a highly credible, trusted, and key cog as an informant, and a well-paid one at that, who, if we go back months, remember the FBI and Christopher Wray's office was saying, we can't release any information publicly about what he had reported regarding the Biden family because it would be a threat to state secrets. It would, of course, chill other informants down the road to burn an informant like that. As they always do when they don't want to release information, they say national security issues, state secrets, sources and methods, etc. Well, ultimately, we found out this. We discovered what was contained in this FBI FD 1023 document where Smirnov alleged that through conversations with Burisma officials that Hunter Biden and perhaps Joe Biden received $5 million bribes in connection with the story that we all know about how Joe Biden went over to the Ukraine while his son was on the board of Burisma and said to Ukraine, you're not going to get X billion dollars unless you fire the prosecutor who is looking into the dirty dealings of the CEO and founder of Burisma. So that story alleged in the 1023 tracked very closely, fit well with the fact patterns that we've seen about the kind of businesses that Hunter Biden was involved in, specifically about what occurred with Ukraine and Burisma, with the fact that according to Smirnov recounting these so purported conversations, the money was papered over so that it would be incredibly hard to track the bribe money that went into the Biden family, et cetera. So this was not the key piece of evidence that was used to pursue an impeachment inquiry into the Bidens. This was sort of the cherry on top. One piece of evidence that corroborated everything else and certainly rhymed with everything else that we knew, as documented in suspicious activity reports and bank statements and substantial testimony under oath from a variety of people in the Biden family's orbit, et cetera, all of which showed us that the key scandal around the Bidens was that they engaged in an international influence peddling scheme, as we've discussed a million times here, through which tens of millions of dollars flowed into the Biden family's coffers across almost 24 shell companies, all the way down to at least one of Joe Biden's grandchildren. And there was never a service rendered for it. Joe Biden was the sole asset of Biden Inc. Nevertheless, the White Special Counsel has achieved the impossible, but not really impossible, of trying to taint and discredit the entire story of the Biden family influence peddling scheme, and to try and tar and toxify and feather and smear the entire impeachment inquiry by linking Alexander Smirnov to Russian agents who supposedly have some nexus to these lies that he purportedly told to FBI officials. And that is the basis of the indictment. The basis of this indictment is that Alexander Smirnov was lying when he said that the Bidens received these bribes, lied about other conversations around the Bidens and Burisma as well. And to sort of bolster the notion that Smirnov is not only unreliable, but potentially a threat to democracy, they don't say that, but they do say is peddling misinformation around the 2024 election from Russia. They link him to a series of 4 unnamed Russian intelligence officials and recount what he's told in recent conversations to FBI officials about how these Russian intelligence officials were talking about how Hunter Biden frequented this Ukrainian hotel, and that the Russians told him they have compromise on a whole series of US officials based upon the fact that the intel agents control a club in a certain hotel overseas, et cetera. So the White Special Counsel goes into all of these details to basically show Smirnov equals Russia or linked to Russia. Smirnov is a liar. He's lied about this purported key point in the Biden impeachment inquiry, that there were bribes, which again, if you go back to the scoping memo of the impeachment inquiry, this was not the key piece of evidence that was looked to, but it was an allegation that they said they were going to look into, and they have. But all of this has been used to discredit the entire impeachment inquiry. And that is why I would argue that Smirnov is kind of the ultimate op. It's been spun as an op to get Democrats to say that the impeachment inquiry ought to be shut down, that if Republicans continue to pursue it, they're doing Putin's bidding. It's been used in articles through reliable mouthpieces for the intelligence community, like Ken Delanian, to quote people in the intelligence community saying, see, this is exactly what we were warning about back in 2020 about Hunter Biden's laptop being Russian disinformation. What is all of this about? Of course, it's about railroading anyone who would dare contribute to a narrative that the left loathes and feels they have to suppress. It's not only Smirnov, by the way. Also, Scott Brady, the U.S. attorney for Pennsylvania, is being attacked by Gerald Nadler, the ranking member on the Judiciary Committee, for supposedly lying when he said that there were things that Smirnov said that were credible when his office looked into these allegations Smirnov was making back in 2020. So to kind of put a bow on this, I mean, there are any number of questions we can ask here. The one thing I'd say up front is, even if Smirnov was a total liar about everything under the sun to the FBI for more than a decade, it does nothing to diminish where the receipts clearly lie, showing the Biden family's rampant corruption and potentially under the law, the fact that they actually took bribes, because if a family member benefits as a consequence of a politician, that counts as a bribe, the way the law is interpreted. It does nothing to diminish the mass, voluminous evidence that shows all of these dubious Biden family dealings. But there are other questions that the Smirnov op raises as well. Like, how is it that this guy was so trusted for over a decade? According to some of the transcripts from the court hearings that have been set to date, he apparently texted this person nearly daily, communicated with them nearly daily on a personal cell phone, not even on an FBI-issued cell phone. This person was so deeply trusted, and yet now he's being completely burned, and the FBI is revealing all of this information that they told us before they're not allowed to reveal publicly. Very strange. There are others who have also pointed out that it may well be that in some instances Smirnov actually was telling the truth, and that the DOJ may have gotten it wrong in their own timeline around these conversations. So there's a lot of intrigue around this. Last but not least, the FBI, or rather the DOJ, made the argument that he ought to be detained. A judge struck them down and said he ought to be released. 2 days later, they went to a different judge to get him detained again, and he was rearrested. And they're basically trying, it seems, to silence this guy and make it very tough for him to defend himself. This is no defense of Smirnov. He could be the most unreliable guy under the sun, but the FBI and DOJ have to show that they are not being totally unreliable with what they're doing to a figure that put forth a piece of evidence that seemed to corroborate a lot of what we saw in this ongoing impeachment inquiry. So I lay all that out there, and I'm curious what your takes are on the significance of this case, and also what this signals maybe about what the national security and law enforcement apparatus is cooking up when it comes to foreign interference in the 2024 election and dis and malinformation as a predicate to engage in more rampant censorship and targeting of dissenters.
I think the timing is obviously everything here. I mean, the idea that they couldn't have fact-checked these claims he was making years ago when they were first brought to the FBI, and they're only being investigated now, is ludicrous. I mean, even if you just read the indictment, right, they point out that Smirnov heard that they were offering a bribe to the Bidens in 2015 and 2016 in meetings. But then they say that Smirnov didn't even have contact with Burisma until 2017. Like, that's an easily verifiable thing that they could have checked up on when he first gave them this tip, and instead it was effectively buried. And then the second thing is, with everyone going after the House Oversight Republicans and saying that they're the ones who've now fallen for a Russian dupe, it was the FBI who went and briefed the Oversight Committee about the veracity of Alexander Smirnov, and they're the ones who told Republicans and all members of the Oversight Committee that he was a highly valued confidential informant and that they had been paying him six figures in order to get access to his information. So the FBI is basically turning the gun on itself in this case and admitting that they failed to properly vet their own CI.
Yeah, I think the big obvious thing they're trying to do is it, as Ben says, it's an op. Hunter Biden's laptop was real. It really was dropped off at that repair store in Delaware. And they're trying to be able to throw something in the water to be like, oh, it's all just Russian disinformation, just kind of like they did, with the CIA letter, the former CIA officials' letter in the run up to the 2020 election. It's BS. It's a BS story, and you can, I don't know, you can just kind of safely ignore it, honestly, and not really feel like you've lost anything of value.
Yeah, my only comment on this is that obviously we know that Christopher Steele gave false information to the FBI and on the behest of an opposition campaign, and no charges were ever filed against him. So this really looks like on the part of the DOJ. I agree with Ben. We don't know what the veracity or the reliability of Smirnov is as a confidential informant, but the selective prosecution is obvious and glaring. So with that, I'm going to transition, because we're out of time, to talk about the net choice cases. There's two different cases that are being looked at together by the Supreme Court, one out of Texas, one arising from a Texas law that generally has put some restrictions on viewpoint-based censorship. So social media companies cannot censor based on viewpoint. That's what the Texas law said. So it's a little bit broader. The Florida law passed by Governor DeSantis is a little bit different, talks about the permanent suspension around elections of people who are running for office, right? So here, obviously, looking at trying to address Twitter suspending Donald Trump, suspending the president of the United States and booting him off their platform, and trying to prevent that going forward, as well as both laws have multiple elements of them as well. Oral argument was fairly skeptical, I would say, in the Supreme Court. There is a split among the sort of right wing of the court, or the 6 justices in the court, clearly, about how they view this. This case is brought by the companies, basically saying that these two states have no right to censor their First Amendments as a corporation to decide what information or who to platform on their social media platforms, right? The interesting sort of thing about this, of course, is that the same companies argue the opposite. In these cases, they are arguing that they are very similar, and they're explicitly relying on a 70s case about the Miami Herald. They are arguing that they are essentially like a newspaper, and that the government cannot force them, for example, to run op-eds by opposing viewpoints if they don't want to, throwing it all the way back to the 70s and the 80s, the Fairness Doctrine, all of this stuff. So they're explicitly arguing that in this case, that they are like newspapers, like the New York Times, like an op-ed page, and that they are curating content. Of course, this brings up the inevitable question, because under Section 230, they are immunized from the kind of liability for what's posted on their sites that newspapers don't get, right? You can't, the New York Times, as much as they lie, they can't cross a line and actually defame somebody. They will be sued for that kind of content because they're presumed responsible for everything that is published in the New York Times. Social media companies don't have that, right? So they kind of want it both ways. In this case, they're arguing that they're more like a newspaper. In the case of Section 230, they're arguing that they're nothing like a newspaper, and that they're actually just a neutral forum for everybody to post what they want, right? So there's a bit of a contradiction there. This case follows last term's case 303 Creative, and I think it's worth bringing that up because this is going to be a doctrine, I think, that even in the best case is going to have to be developed over time, because there are rights, that First Amendment rights, that people have, and then this is the whole corporations, are corporations people, and to what extent question, right? Going all the way back to 2012 and Mitt Romney saying, corporations are people too. To what extent does a corporation have First Amendment rights if those First Amendment rights include censoring what has really become the digital town square, and censoring people's voices or viewpoints within that square? And I think there's a spectrum that's going to have to be worked out, and we're going to have to come up with a whatever it is, another 3-pronged doctrine test to determine this kind of thing, because clearly in the case of 303 Creative, you have one individual person engaging in a commercial but creative activity. In this case, it was designing wedding websites. And in 303 Creative, the court decides, yes, you do have First Amendment rights. Just because you're participating in the marketplace doesn't mean you lose your First Amendment rights. You're designing websites. You have the right to not design, for example, a website for a gay wedding if that violates your religious convictions, right? In the middle, I would say, are cases like Hobby Lobby, where it's a privately held company. And again, the courts decided, right, that Hobby Lobby has some First Amendment rights in terms of what benefits it can offer its employees. And then on the other hand, you have a huge publicly traded company where there really isn't one unit, like there's not one family or one sort of viewpoint. There's a corporate entity that's publicly traded. And as of now, and unfortunately, I think probably still in this case, you'll probably get a jumble of views that ultimately sides with the idea that these corporations, these publicly held corporations, do have full First Amendment rights. But I think that spectrum is something that's going to have to be worked out. There's clearly some of the justices are very much cognizant of the problem that is created when these social media companies are able to censor. And actually, Philip Hamburger had a great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today or yesterday delineating, among other very good points he makes, pointing out how backwards the posture of all of these cases are, and how the censorship regime actually works. In the past, before, when we weren't talking about the collusion between government and these companies that can just mass censor a particular idea or a particular viewpoint, you had there are very, very strong protections against prior restraint on speech, right? So most free speech cases were of free speech happening and people hearing the free speech, and then the government coming in and trying to censor the speech after the fact and saying, like, no, like, this is, either to punish the person who for that speech, and then you fight it out. So the government has to take the case to court, right? The person speaks, and then the government has to take the case to court, and the person says, no, this is protected by the First Amendment, and the government says, no, your particular speech is not, for whatever reasons, and the government's taking the burden of going to court. In this case, the censored have to take the burden in most of these cases to try to protect their ability to speak. They are preemptively unable to speak, and that posture makes a huge difference in terms of how effective the censorship is. Finally, I mean, there's a lot of different ways. I think this kind of thorny problem of First Amendment rights for corporations, mass media censorship, the collusion between government and these companies that we saw so clearly in the case of COVID and in the Twitter files, right? I think this can go in a number of ways. You can, some of these, the Texas and Florida law, these are really, I would call these types of public accommodation. Will, I know, I'm sure he'll weigh in a minute here, has been an advocate for a long time that the way to deal with this kind of coordinated censorship is through public accommodations law, much like the Civil Rights Act has public accommodations to deal with collective, essentially, refusal by multiple actors in a market to serve a particular customer. That's one way you could go about it. Justice Thomas seems pretty adamant that these corporations can and should be considered common carriers, or more like a telephone company than a op-ed page, right? The telephone company can't prevent you from calling and saying what you want to your friend. They're a common carrier and they have to serve essentially all customers. That seems to be the direction that Justice Thomas is going in. There's, again, that spectrum, as I talked about from the individual person acting as a participant in the market and how much protection he or she should have from the First Amendment versus a publicly traded company, and that spectrum. So all of this to say, I'm not particularly encouraged by this particular round of oral argument, but I think we will have a wing of the court that builds up this kind of doctrine over time. I think it's obvious that we need a new set of doctrines and a new understanding of how the First Amendment applies both to individuals and to corporations, and how those understandings might be different, because clearly this is the shape of the type of censorship that we're likely to face going forward. And so it'll be interesting to see the court grapple with it. But as of now, my sad prediction is that I don't think, from this oral argument, I don't think we have enough justices to really bring down the hammer in this case. I'm more predicting, you'll probably have multiple opinions and multiple justifications, but ultimately coming down for now on the side of the corporations. But I don't know if you guys have different predictions or what you think about this problem legally, because clearly it's calling out for a solution, and we can't just rely on the fact, we can't rely on Elon Musk to buy each of these platforms and make them free speech zones. So
I'll just weigh in very briefly on your question of if I agree on where the justices are kind of swaying at this point. And I agree with your assessment. And as I was reading some of the reactions to the arguments this morning in Wall Street Journal, and some of the justices were saying, we don't really feel like it's either or. We don't really feel like these social media companies are publishers like a news outlet would be, but we also don't quite feel like they're like the Wild West public square. We feel like it's somewhere in the middle. And so I think any ruling on this is probably going to be fairly narrowly tailored.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll try to be brief here. I listened to both the oral arguments and then also read through the transcripts before this show. The big takeaway, I think, ultimately, that NetChoice and the tech companies are going to lose for now on the basis that they're putting forward a facial challenge to the entire statutes, both in Florida and Texas. And the Supreme Court seemed pretty skeptical that the entirety of these statutes was plainly unconstitutional, that they were clearly, and oddly enough, it was some of the progressive justices who were a little better on this question. Justice Kagan pointing out that the way that Paul Clement and others wanted them to rule would, butt into the entirety of public accommodations law. So I think ultimately it's not going to be a big setback. That said, it is disappointing to listen to some of the justices who clearly have a pretty significant bias against any sort of tech regulation. Like I heard Justice Kavanaugh say something like I only think of Orwellian when it comes to state action. And I'm like, I just want to look at him and be like, you realize Orwell was a socialist, right? Like he was not a libertarian, dude. Like there's a lot of ways in which corporate power can be pretty oppressive. So hopefully the next time this comes up, we won't get a terrible ruling that really constrains free speech.
Yeah, I concur in everyone's remarks. I listened to the oral argument sort of in the background yesterday, and I would reserve my full judgment until I actually read the transcripts. But it struck me that there was little clarity, not only among the justices, but even among the parties arguing either sides. And this seems like such a nuanced area and developing area that it's almost impossible to find clarity, even among people who are tasked with defending either side of the cases. There also did not seem to be any unanimity whatsoever among the justices themselves, and they each kind of hacked at it from different angles. There were the Section 230 questions raised by Justice Gorsuch, for example. Justice Alito, I think rightfully, was trying to get net choice and really also the Biden administration, frankly, on record as saying, is content moderation really just a euphemism for censorship? They didn't even really get into, as best as I can recall, maybe will correct me if I'm wrong here, the notion that the platforms themselves have been co-opted by the federal government. That didn't even really come up in it. It will come up when we get to Murthy v. Missouri. And those arguments are in a few weeks. So I guess I don't think we're going to get any resolution on how the public can have recourse against the social media companies necessarily via these cases. But I do think it is coming in the near term.
And with that, I'm going to transition back to Will. We're going to talk about Google's Gemini AI and what it shows about the company that used to have the tagline, do good, don't be evil, right? Sorry.
Right. So, as I discussed in the very first segment, the purpose of the system is what it does. And Google created an AI who's very, I think Mike Solana, who's at Pirate Wires, had a wonderful little take on it where he said, we have designed some of the most powerful computing engines in the history of the world, capable of answering any question on any topic immediately. And the first thing we asked that machine to do was to lie. And that's basically what the Google did. They started out and they built an AI. And the very first thing they did was they asked it to lie. I mean, the most obvious way in which it lied was through generating images. Asked to provide a question of famous 17th century physicists. It included a bunch of people of African-American heritage as the famous 17th century physicists. That is ahistorical. You had, asked to provide an image of founding fathers. You had Black founding fathers. Asked to provide an image of, I think, even Nazis. You had Black Nazis. And it was clear that the way that they had created their image AI generation basically inserted a layer of, you must add diversity to all of these photographs. But like diversity in particular, meaning people of color. So it created all sorts of ahistorical, false, just ridiculous images that revealed at the heart, like how silly Google has become as a company, completely captive to woke and left-wing ideology. And it's not a surprise the guy in charge of Google's Gemini AI, this guy, Jack Krawczyk, is just the epitome of like the woke Silicon Valley liberal. And it's not merely the image generation that's off. People started doing, asking questions of Google's text AI and found that it couldn't discern who was worse between Elon Musk and Hitler, saying that there were compelling arguments for both sides in that case, and a variety of other who's worse, Chris Rufo or Stalin, couldn't figure out which one was worse. It's sort of like it's an amplification of the most ridiculous leftist ideology, and it's what happens when you have somebody injecting that behind it. I've had some friends suggest it's also just straight up lying about people. That's another thing, accusing Tim Pool of, for example, participating in the Charlottesville rally just by asking the wrong question. So it's not only making, incapable of making reasonable value judgments and putting out false images, it's literally making an engine of defamation of various individuals. So a totally useless AI. It's extremely embarrassing, but it's also very damaging. I think in some sense, the fear of AI taking over the world is a little overblown, but what AI certainly looks to become is kind of the replacement for search, in effect, the portal for which how humans understand the world. And if that portal that is run by Google, which is already a dominant monopoly in search, becomes the dominant monopoly for AI learning, right, in the sense of the AI portal for everybody, well, then we're going to have this unbelievably damaging woke AI portal for everybody running things and informing how our children learn, how our children come to understand things. That's very dangerous in and of itself. It also indicates that probably Google search is already a terrible product. And so there really should be some sort of policy remedy. I think a big part of, we talk a lot about antitrust remedies against Google, but it's clear, I think what we should want is that we don't want Google as a company to have all this power, to be the dominant player in search if they don't earn it. And so I think it's a really simple means to go after Google's monopoly power in search is to say that the type of contracts that they have with companies like Apple, where they give Apple $20 billion a year in exchange for being the default search engine on Apple Safari, on every Apple phone that goes out. We say that those type of contracts are illegal, that Apple's not allowed to sell that the only way to have that, that basically it must be an option available to the user that the first time they open Apple Safari, they get to pick their search engine. They don't have Google fed to them as a default. That would do a lot of damage to Google and I think be a good thing here. But yeah, the general rule here, you don't want to hear any bleeding from tech apologists about how Google isn't really trying to be so woke and inaccurate. The purpose of a system is what it does. This is the biggest company in the world that put out a product that's an engine of defamation and laughably stupid. And they should be embarrassed.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been worried about who AI is going to put out of work. Maybe it will turn out that the first people to really be put out of work by AI are woke HR ladies, because it seems like that's what Gemini is very capable at replicating, right? Jokes aside, I think I want to highlight or further highlight something that Will pointed out, right? The same people who created this AI that shows the absolute absurdity of kind of cultural leftist premises taken to their logical extreme. Those same people are currently in charge of the infrastructure that is more or less the way that the majority of people determine truth from falsity. It doesn't even have to be that we move to the next iteration of essentially the Google search, the AI. The Google search itself, these same people are responsible for the algorithm that brings up whether something is true or false. If you Google, is this quote fake, right? So I think that is worth worrying about. And I think it's really worth thinking about or exploring the kind of regulation that Will is pointing to, and whether one company should have this kind of control over essentially the mechanisms by which people form their opinions and determine, again, truth from falsity. And then just as a final point, Google is particularly left-leaning. If you look at donations going to Republicans and Democrats from people who work for various companies, but it's far from alone. The entire tech sector is heavily, heavily left-leaning. Most professional class people are left-leaning. This is, James Burnham's managerial class, right? And they have a very strong political perspective. I would call it sort of woke neoliberalism for the most part. And that class of people is overwhelmingly powerful in terms of not just creating products like Gemini, right? But also in terms of policy and self-dealing to this class of setting, setting essentially the boundaries of policy in such a way that this professional class, which is maybe it's not really the 1% or the 1% of 1% that the billionaires that Bernie is always railing about. It really is this 20% of sort of professional class earners that have solidified into a very noticeable and very powerful interest group with particular political perspectives that are really at odds with the other 80% of Americans. And we have created a lot of policy that gives them disproportionate power in terms of being able to effectuate that perspective, whether through the private sector or through the government. So I think that's structurally something that we're going to have to grapple with, in almost every issue going forward.
This is sort of a tangential point, but one that I thought of when Inez was talking about this issue of how people do discern what's true or false based on these types of online tools. And I think there's a generational question to explore here where it seems like millennials were sort of the first generation to have like digital media literacy courses in their schools. At least I know everyone in my school, we had to go through all of these courses at the library where we had to learn how to discern what information on the internet was true and what was false. And I think we've actually boomeranged back in the other direction where now Gen Z and below, Generation Alpha after them, are almost like boomers in the way that they consume media content and how willing they are to believe everything that they read on the internet. So you really can't understate how much of an impact things like Google Gemini actually do have on people's conception of the world. And just another, funny example of some of the ahistorical things they were coming up with. I saw an AI-generated photo on a news story that showed a series of shoplifters all as white women. And I think the last time white women were representative of shoplifters was when Winona Ryder decided to steal some designer sunglasses from Saks Fifth Avenue. And so it was just another incredible example of how these tools manage to make white people the bad guy, no matter what exactly the scenario is and what the, of course, real demographic statistics are in regards to the things that they're portraying.
And I think it was the FBI that actually used one of those images in a tweet about the scourge of shoplifting in America. So there are real consequences to it. Look at law enforcement promoting it. I mean, I'm kind of two minds on this. Elon Musk sort of made light of this and said, this is, I'm paraphrasing him, this is inadvertently a great thing because it exposes just how the lunacy of the people behind AI in Silicon Valley. But on the other hand, for younger generations, they may not realize the lunacy of it. They may well be indoctrinated in it, especially if they're going to school is populated by people with the same worldview and desire to indoctrinate as the people behind the AI tools. We'll open by kind of talking about the fact that the first thing that the machines did was lie. And the question is always lying towards what end? And to me, the end is power and control. This is another means by which, in the parlance of the censorship industrial complex, they're trying to engineer and take over our cognitive infrastructure towards their favored progressive ends. And so any and every tool, to the extent the machines are going to reflect the prejudices and predilections of their makers, they're all going to point towards progressive takeover of our quote unquote cognitive infrastructure. And it's going to lead to an untenable situation down the road where people are going to have to unplug essentially from the woke Borg that's going to be imposed on us. And obviously, again, given the schools are dominated by like-minded people, it's going to be a crisis, ultimately, a crisis of the American mind, which we've already been suffering from for years, but I think is only going to accelerate and worse going forward.
With that, I think we'll transition to final thoughts. And Amber, if you could give us your thoughts first.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking more on this illegal immigration question, and we were sort of talking about the way that the left tries to distract from the point by talking about the relative crime rates of native-born citizens versus illegal immigrants. And I 100% agree with everyone pointing out that it completely misses the point. But even if we are to argue on the merits of that point, it's not true. There's one study that actually measures crime rates of illegal immigrants, and it's in Texas because they're the only state that really tracks those types of metrics. And this is often used as the left sort of calling card to prove that illegal immigrants actually commit less crime than native-born citizens. And the Center for Immigration Studies did a great debunking of this study by pointing out that it only identifies illegal immigrants if their immigration status is known at the time of their arrest. And if you actually go through and assign immigration status that's found out months, years later throughout the legal process and assign it to all of the subjects in this study, you actually find out that the illegal immigrant crime rate is higher than native-born citizens, which I don't think would be a surprise to anyone on this podcast. But not only that, but the violent crime rate among illegal immigrants is significantly higher than native-born citizens. So even the premise of that point that's often made by the left is false.
I'll be really brief, and I don't necessarily have a takeaway from this, but I just thought it was worth noting this week. We got word just before this podcast, I guess a day before, that U.S. Air Force member Aaron Bushnell lit himself on fire outside of the Israeli embassy in Washington and perished as a consequence of his burns. And he lit himself on fire in protest of Israel's counteroffensive against Hamas, under the claim that Israel was engaging in a genocide, which is patently false. And of course, all of the statistics show that in the most difficult possible situation to protect the lives of civilians who basically serve as one massive human shield for Hamas that built all of its infrastructure beneath all of the pivotal civilian areas in Gaza, and where Israel has to operate in incredibly close quarters, surrounded by people in plain clothes who may or may not themselves be terrorists or supporting or harboring those terrorists, the ratio of civilians versus Hamas members killed is ridiculously low. So it's the most pretty much humanitarian war ever waged under the most difficult scenario possible to try to protect the lives of the civilians there. But a member of the U.S. Air Force apparently considers it a genocide. And to me, this literally personifies the self-immolation of the West, how corrupted the Western mind is, that it can be so deeply indoctrinated and corrupted that you have a member of the Air Force literally set himself on fire on the basis of a lie and kill himself. This is where we are. And to the extent there are people like this serving in the armed forces, what does that augur about what happens when America has to deal with communist China or any of a number of other foreign threats that we face? Will we even get there to the extent Americans are being produced like this unfortunate and tragic example that we're seeing from this former Air Force official? So a terrible story, but I think an illustrative story of where we are in the West right now.
Yeah, when I was reading about this guy, it struck me that there was the entire attempt to root out "quote unquote" political extremists from the military, if anyone remembers, especially around vaccine mandates and anybody who was part of the Minutemen, for example, who are sort of a quasi militia group on the border that helps guard the border and makes calls to border patrol. There was just a lot of concern around political extremism in the military from the Pentagon. Apparently, those screens did not catch somebody who is such an extremist that he was willing to set himself on fire for a political cause. Those dragnets were not set to look for political extremism on the left. My final thought is this Free Press report that went out a couple days ago, and I think is worth considering, especially for parents of kids in their teens. It's a brave new world out there in terms of drugs. Fentanyl is in everything, and it's very difficult to tell. And what we're seeing is an overdose epidemic among kids and then among Americans generally that differs from what we might call the overdose epidemic that we already knew about, the deaths of despair and so on. These are essentially accidental. These are kids who are taking what they think is Adderall or Percocet, taking one pill and dying because the way that these drugs are made and cut with fentanyl, and the ease with which fentanyl can cause overdose death because it's so incredibly potent is just changing the landscape of drugs. It's really no longer possible to have a youthful flirtation with a few drugs. And I think that's unfortunately probably our new reality. And unfortunately, a lot of kids and adults, frankly, are paying the price. They think that they're doing a line of Coke, or they think they're doing Adderall, or they think they're doing something like Percocet. In fact, what they're getting is fentanyl, and sometimes in fatal doses. And it's very, very difficult to tell in advance when that's so. So that's a new and scary landscape out there.
Yeah, I got an update on the Georgia Fani Willis case. It sounds like there's an hearing yesterday where the judge talked to Mr. Bradley, who is Nathan Wade's former law partner and supposed lawyer. Mr. Bradley had claimed privilege when in the hearing about a week ago, saying that he couldn't talk about whether or not Willis and Wade had a relationship that predated 2022. Now that privilege has been pierced. The judges said we're going to have a hearing on the record today, and that's going to happen in a couple hours from recording. I'm excited to see it. It's looking very, very bad for Willis and Wade, also because in the interim since last week's podcast, we've learned that there is a slew of cell phone data and tower data that shows that Mr. Wade was over at Miss Willis's apartment repeatedly before 2022 at all hours of the night. That they exchanged thousands of phone calls and tens of thousands of text messages, that they were very clearly it looks like they were very clearly in a relationship, which means they lied to the court and perjured themselves. Hopefully this ends with both of them disbarred and the entire Fulton County District Attorney's Office disqualified from handling the case, which could actually be the end of the case, because this is such a big and sprawling case that it really does need a big District Attorney's Office to handle it. And if the entire Fulton County District Attorney's Office is kicked off the case, it's not clear that another District Attorney's Office will take it on.
Yeah, really, that case really is like the Real Housewives of the Rubicon. Just a really spectacular immolation over there. And with that, that's the end of our show this week. So on behalf of Will, Ben, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and I'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.